You think you've paid for the device you're watching this video on right now. You think the chair beneath you, the house you live in, even the cash in your pocket belongs to you. You're wrong. You own nothing. You are simply renting values that the true owners of the world have allowed you to use. Throughout history, we've been led to believe that great wars, revolutions, and inventions changed the world. Those were all just a smoke screen. Behind the curtain, there was only one truth: whoever holds the printing press holds the world. Conquests that were made with swords 1,000 years ago are made with bank receipts today. A handful of families, whose names you don't even know, who don't even deign to appear on Forbes lists, decide what you eat, which war you'll fight in, and how many years of your life you'll spend paying off a debt. The Medicis started this game, the Rothschilds wrote the rules, and the Rockefellers took the title deed to the system. Now sit back and watch, because I am about to explain the architects of the global financial system that governs your world. Are you ready to meet the masters of money? So how did it all begin? Why did humanity suddenly abandon that pure, honest barter system and choose to become bound to these pieces of paper? In the old days, everything was real. If you had a chicken, you had a chicken. If you had wheat, you had wheat. If you needed shoes, you would take a sack of wheat to the cobbler. We called this barter. But this system had a fatal flaw: it couldn't scale. You couldn't feed an army through barter. You couldn't tell thousands of soldiers, carry 3 goats each as your salary. As cities grew and kingdoms expanded, a need arose for a portable and standardized value. At that moment, the greatest gamble in human history was played. 7th century BC, Lydia. In modern-day Turkey, the first coin was minted. But pay attention, it wasn't a merchant who minted the money, it was the state. When King Alyattes melted gold and silver and stamped a lion's seal on it, he was essentially saying, "The value of this metal is not determined by the ore inside, but by my seal upon it. And it is worth whatever I say it is." Money wasn't just a tool to make our lives easier. It was also a way to consolidate central power. Now, the king could buy the people's real goods, their grain, their animals, their labor, with these metal slugs, and then collect those slugs back under the name of taxes. In other words, from the very beginning, money was a tool for tax collection and a way to store human energy. But this was only the beginning. Metal coins ruled the world for 1,000 years, but they had a problem. They were heavy and limited. If you truly want to rule the world, you must be able to sell something you don't have. This is exactly where paper money was born, from the greed of creating something out of nothing. The first traces of paper money appeared in 7th century China. Instead of carrying heavy copper coins, merchants would entrust them to reliable people and receive a receipt in return. Centuries later, this practical tool of trade was seized and transformed into a lethal instrument of power by the Mongol leader Kublai Khan. Khan issued papers stamped with his own seal and imposed the harshest law in history: anyone who refuses to accept this paper shall be killed on the spot. This was the first fiat money in history. It wasn't valuable because there was physical gold or silver behind it. It was valuable because of the state's threat to take your head. But brutal force can only take you so far. To truly own the world, you don't need an executioner's blade, you need a ledger. You need a system that makes people want to be indebted to you. At this very point, a family rose from the misty streets of Florence, the Medicis. They took that simple receipt trick used by goldsmiths and transformed it into the greatest power software in world history. Before the Medicis, being wealthy was considered a sin. The church was screaming that charging interest was forbidden, but the Medicis found a devilish way to bypass this obstacle. They didn't sell money as a debt, They sold it under the guise of service fees and currency exchange differences. In other words, they followed the rules to the letter while completely bypassing the spirit of the law. Cosimo, the mastermind of the family, knew one thing very well. True power belongs not to the one wearing the crown, but to the one who pays for it. The Medicis were never kings. They never walked around with scepters. They appeared as ordinary citizens of Florence while putting all the city's politicians on their payroll. If a law was to be passed, it was first approved in the dusty backrooms of the Medici Bank. And how did they maintain this power? Through a terrifying data network. They opened branches in every major European city: London, Bruges, Rome. These branches didn't just transfer money, they were the world's first intelligence agency. The Medicis knew which king was on the brink of bankruptcy or which army was about to attack long before anyone else. Information turned into money, and money turned into absolute control. The Medici's biggest gamble was the Vatican. Back then, the Church was the world's largest landowner and political force. The Medicis began managing all the Pope's taxes, the funds for the Crusades, and the revenues from indulgences. The papers sold to grant a place in heaven. Even God's representative on earth was coming to the Medicis for loans. Even the Pope was beholden to them. Money was no longer just the master of trade, it was now the master of the soul. The greatest masterpieces of art, Michelangelo's sculptures, Da Vinci's brushstrokes, were all financed with this borrowed money. The Medicis used art to sanctify their own power. In every Renaissance masterpiece we admire today, there is the invisible signature of this massive banking network. The Medicis proved one thing: defeating an army with a sword is difficult and costly. But drowning that army's king in debt, that is a bloodless conquest. As the Medicis gave states money that didn't exist in the form of credit notes, they mortgaged the future of those nations. The king's army was getting stronger, but the king's will was being locked away in the Medici vaults. However, the Medicis only ruled one city and one religious institution. The legacy they left behind would be handed over to a much more dangerous and global mind. The Medicis had built the system, but those who would spread that system to the entire world, bringing kings to their knees and turning nations into their private property, would be the Rothschilds, the family that wrapped Europe in their 5 branches. Now we enter the story of the famous 5 houses that emerged from the dark alleys of Frankfurt to cover the entire world like a spider web, the true empire of money. The Medicis had shown how important it was to control money, but the Rothschilds turned it into a weapon. To understand the rise of the Rothschilds, we must look at the Jewish ghetto, Judengasse, where Mayor Amschel lived in Frankfurt. According to Mayor Amschel Rothschilds, "Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." This was the declaration of a debt-based financial system that would last for centuries. Back then, Jewish communities were scattered across Europe. This gave Mayer a unique advantage. When he sent his 5 sons to the 5 major capitals of Europe, they were able to instantly integrate into an already established commercial network, the Jewish diaspora. Their greatest weapon was their language. They wrote their encrypted letters in Yiddish, German written with the Hebrew alphabet. Even if an intelligence officer intercepted these letters, they were impossible to crack. This allowed the family to create the world's first end-to-end encrypted private intelligence network. Mayor Amschel drove his 5 sons into the 5 hearts of Europe like 5 daggers: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. They built the largest intelligence and financial web in history. The Rothschilds didn't get rich by selling goods or trading spices. They changed the way nations borrowed money. In the past, if a king needed money, he would borrow gold from a wealthy person. The Rothschilds, however, built the system on government bonds. Let's say England is going to war and needs £100 million. The Rothschilds don't just hand over the cash. They say, issue papers, otherwise known as bonds. These will be your debt to your own people. I will sell these papers to the wealthy across Europe and bring you the money. But in return, only I will manage the trade of these papers. Thus, the Rothschilds seized the power of national borrowing. Nations no longer got their money from the people, they got it from the market the Rothschilds controlled. Here is the real sting. When a state couldn't pay back the debt, the Rothschilds didn't demand the money immediately. They said, "Can't pay? No problem. Let us give you a new loan just so you can pay the interest on the old one." At this point, empires like England, France, and Austria became interest slaves. Entire populations were working and paying taxes, but that money wasn't going to roads or bridges. It was flowing directly into the interest accounts of a single family in Frankfurt. The Rothschilds realized that owning the money wasn't enough. You had to control the institution that prints it. By the mid-1800s, most central banks in Europe were either directly controlled by them or beholden to them. When you control a nation's central bank, you decide the value of its currency. You can trigger inflation to melt people's savings or raise interest rates to bury everyone in debt. These men didn't earn the money that rules the world by working hard. They designed a mathematical system to keep nations permanently in debt. The more wars and crises broke out, the more debt states took on, and the more powerful the Rothschilds became. No matter who won the war, the one collecting the interest was always them. The Rothschilds sat on the heads of states through debt and interest. But at the turn of the 20th century, the rules of the game changed. Paper debt was no longer enough. One had to monopolize the new fuel of the world, energy and industry. And right here across the ocean, a man enters the stage who would take financial power and turn it into an industrial empire: John D. Rockefeller. The Rothschilds had indebted nations through paper debt, but John D. Rockefeller played a much more physical and different game in America. Rockefeller wasn't just an oilman, he was a logistics executioner who held his competitors' windpipes in his grip. How did an ordinary man manage to gather all his rivals under a single flag, Standard Oil? Did he have enough money to buy everyone out? No. Before he even earned the money, he destroyed his competitors' ability to earn any. In the 1870s, to sell your oil, you had to transport it by train. At the time, railroad companies were in cutthroat competition with each other, struggling to fill their trains and living in constant fear of bankruptcy. Rockefeller saw this fear and sat at the table. He told the railroad tycoons, "I will fill your trains. Every day, every week, I will ship a fixed and massive amount of oil exclusively through your lines. Your trains will never run empty and your cash flow will be guaranteed." For the railroads on the brink of collapse, this was an irresistible offer. But in exchange, Rockefeller demanded a condition that would rig the entire game: secret rebates and drawbacks. Not only did he ship his own oil for cheap, but he also forced the railroads to agree to this. "When my competitors ship oil with you, you will charge them full price. But you will take a portion of that money they paid you and quietly hand it back to me as a service fee." Rockefeller was growing his empire using the money his competitors spent. Before the rival even stepped onto the field, the shipping costs he paid were financing Rockefeller. With this logistics advantage, Rockefeller dropped his prices so low that his rivals began to suffer massive losses. Their shipping costs were double his, and with every sale they were effectively earning money for Rockefeller. Rockefeller then knocked on the doors of these broken rivals and offered them two choices: either trade your company for my Standard Oil shares, or I will keep playing this game until I push you to the bottom of bankruptcy. This is known in history as the Cleveland Massacre. In just 3 months, he swallowed 22 of his 26 rivals in this manner. Those who refused were simply erased from the market using his power over the railroads. Rockefeller grew so large that he eventually controlled 90% of the oil in America. The American government, fearing this power, broke Standard Oil into 34 pieces on the grounds that it was a monopoly. But Rockefeller won anyway, because he still held the lion's share in every one of those 34 companies, the ancestors of today's ExxonMobil, Chevron, and BP. That victory created a fortune so massive that no single bank could contain it. Yet, something quiet was happening behind the scenes. The rising American industries began to align with Europe's century-old financial structures. Power, they realized, was stronger when shared than when fought over. Then came 1913. The landscape of global finance shifted forever. Official records call it a government act, but behind the curtain the system spoke the language of power. No longer did the state simply issue currency. It relied on a mechanism far more intricate, a web of borrowing and obligation. Take a simple scenario. A new bridge is to be built, $1 billion required. With a press of a button, the money appears, but it is not a gift, it carries a promise, a responsibility. In return, the state issues a government bond, a pledge to repay. And here is where the true force of the system emerges. Money is no longer just value, it is a ledger of human effort, a map of labor across an entire nation. This is the formula of the modern age. Capital comes into existence when demanded, and countless lives are spent repaying the invisible rent on money that did not exist until it was borrowed. Debt weaves through life like an unseen chain, and the world beats to its rhythm. Has this era come to an end? No, it has simply changed names. Today, we no longer see the names Rockefeller or Rothschild everywhere, because this power is now hidden behind giant investment firms like BlackRock and Vanguard. Behind all those ultra-rich genius kids you see on your screens, the heroes who are said to have started their companies in a garage, lies the capital of these very funds. And they sold us the fairy tale: if you work hard enough, you can be just like them. But as we move further into the 21st century, the game is evolving once again. Today, many see the digital revolution as an escape. They believe blockchain will finally break this 3,000-year-old cycle. But history teaches us that power doesn't disappear, it simply adapts. Would the families that have managed the world's wealth for centuries truly be sidelined by a few lines of code? No. They are not resisting the change, they are leading it. This brings us to central bank digital currencies, CBDC. This is not just a new way to pay, it is the ultimate transformation of money. In a fully digital system, money becomes programmable. It is no longer just a store of value, but a tool for behavior, where your ability to spend is tied to social compliance. From the gold coins of Lydia to the digital ledgers of today, the medium has changed, but the goal remains. Money is the tool to control human energy. The printing press has evolved into a global, invisible network of data. We surrendered our freedom to paper, and now that paper is becoming code. The question is no longer about the money in your pocket, but the terms of the system you are forced to use. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.